Why was the fog always thickest when you needed clarity the most? I'd been moving through the mountains for 6 hours alone, cold, unseen. The air was thin enough to sting my lungs, and the silence was so complete it felt alive. Somewhere far below me, a SEAL team was setting up for their assault, unaware that another set of eyes, mine, was watching the same ridge through a scope. They didn't know I existed. They weren't supposed to. That's the thing about working in shadows. Your victories are invisible, and so are your fears. The mission had been straightforward when it started. Track enemy movements. Observe, report, remain undetected. Nothing more. No engagement, no contact, no glory. I was fine with that. After years in uniform, I'd learned that the quietest missions were often the deadliest. But then the radio broke the silence. A voice came through, ragged with adrenaline. Contact. Multiple enemy shooters on the ridgeline, can't even see them. Static, then another voice, lower, tense. Enemies at 2,000 meters. That's beyond our capability. We need specialized support, but there's no time. My hand froze on the radio. 2,000 meters. That was extreme range work, my kind of work. But I wasn't part of their team. Not officially. Not even they knew I was up here. Still, if they went down, my mission died with them. And sometimes, following orders isn't as important as following conscience. So I stepped out of the fog. I could see their shapes below, 12 men taking cover behind jagged rocks, rifles pressed tight against their shoulders, eyes scanning for ghosts they couldn't find. I moved toward them, my rifle slung across my back, boots silent on the wet stone. The first one to see me froze. His weapon twitched upward, confused, unsure if I was friend or foe. "Who the hell are you?" someone shouted. I didn't answer. I just unslung my .338 Lapua, dropped to prone, and set up my bipod on a flat rock. My voice came calm, steady, without hesitation. "I've got the distance." For a moment, no one moved. Then the SEAL team leader, tall, clean-cut, the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved out of discipline, stepped closer. "What did you just say?" I said, "I've got the distance." He didn't know it yet, but the next few minutes would decide whether any of them left this mountain alive. The mission had started 72 hours ago, back when I still believed I could finish it quietly. The brass had identified a high-value enemy commander, meeting with foreign fighters in a remote compound deep in these ridges. The SEALs were to confirm his presence and execute a raid if conditions allowed. My assignment was simpler and lonelier. Independent surveillance, high-altitude insertion, no contact. I jumped in solo under night canopy 3 days earlier, parachuting into the mountains at 8,000 feet, carrying nothing but my gear, my rifle, and the one thing most soldiers lose too soon, patience. For 3 days I'd been a ghost. No footprints, no movement, no sound. I'd mapped patrol routes, marked sentry rotations, memorized the shape of every boulder and tree trunk that could hide a rifle barrel. I'd eaten cold rations and melted snow for water, sleeping in hides barely large enough to breathe in. And now the ghost had to reveal herself. The SEAL leader crouched beside me. "Lieutenant Jake Morrison," he said, "you're out of your lane, Sergeant." "Staff Sergeant Hadley Mitchell," I replied. "Independent surveillance element. I heard your transmission. You've got enemy shooters engaging from over 2,000 meters. You need someone who can reach them. That's me." His eyes narrowed. "We didn't request." "I know," I cut in. "You weren't briefed on my presence. My operations compartmented. Only your task force commander knew I was here. But right now, you're getting pinned down by marksmen who outrange your rifles. You can argue later, Lieutenant. Right now, tell me, where are they?" The second-in-command, Chief Ryan Carter, pointed toward the northern ridgeline, a vague smudge through the shifting fog. "Up there somewhere, 2 or 3 shooters. We can't pin their positions. One of my guys took a round through his plate carrier. Lucky it didn't punch through." I lifted my rangefinder and scanned the ridge. The fog breathed like a living thing, thick one moment, thinning the next. My readings flickered between numbers. 195020802110. That was it, 2 kilometers of air between us and them. "Lieutenant," I said, "I need your men to stay put for 15 minutes. No return fire. Let them think you're trapped. They'll relax. When they expose themselves, I'll handle the rest." He stared at me, uncertain but desperate. "And you can hit from that far out." I met his gaze. "My longest confirmed kill is 2,450 meters. 2,000 won't be a problem." His expression changed, not belief exactly, but the kind of wary hope soldiers get when logic has failed and all that's left is faith. He nodded once. "Do it." I adjusted my rifle on the rock, folding into the familiar rhythm. Range, elevation, wind, humidity, temperature. The math of death. My breathing slowed, heartbeat sinking with the faint wind rustling through the fog. Minutes passed, then a flicker of movement. A shadow on the ridge, half seen through the mist. I tracked it, fine-tuned my focus. There, a muzzle flash. The enemy sniper had just fired. I called out quietly, "Target acquired. Northern ridge, 2,047 meters." The world narrowed to a single heartbeat. Wind, 12 miles per hour. Temperature, 52 degrees. I adjusted 41.8 MOA for elevation, 7.6 for windage. My rifle's barrel glistened with condensation as I settled my cheek to the stock. Then silence. I fired. The recoil hit my shoulder like a living thing, but I stayed in the scope. The bullet's flight time, 3.1 seconds, stretched into eternity. 1, 2, 3, impact. Through the glass, I saw the enemy sniper fall sideways, a puppet whose strings had just been cut. "Target down," I said softly. The SEALs stared. For them it was impossible, a shot beyond belief. For me, it was just precision meeting purpose. Morrison exhaled. "Confirmed, enemy sniper down. Holy, you actually hit him." I worked the bolt smoothly. "You said there were 3, let's find the rest." Fog rolled back in thicker this time. I waited. Patience was everything. Fog hides movement, but it also hides mistakes. 4 minutes later, the mist lifted again, just enough. Another figure. Another setup. 2,120 meters this time, slightly west. I recalculated, fired. Another hit, another silence. "Two down," I murmured. When I looked up, Chief Carter's mouth was slightly open, his voice almost reverent. "Those were the best shots I've ever seen." "It's just math, Chief," I said. "Measure right, calculate right, execute right. The rest is just distance." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't the full truth. Math doesn't control the wind. Math doesn't calm the hands that tremble when they realize they're taking a life. There's always something human between the numbers, something fragile and unspoken. When the shooting stopped, we moved toward the valley. I followed the SEALs, staying just above them on the slope, overwatch position. Morrison kept glancing at me, as if trying to read the story behind my calm. "You always work alone?" he finally asked. "I prefer it," I said. "No one to compromise me, no one to slow me down." He nodded, understanding more than he said. By the time we reached the observation point, the fog was thinning, revealing a compound in the valley below our target. Through my scope, I saw the layout. 3 defensive positions, 20 hostiles visible, relaxed but armed. Morrison's voice was steady. "Can you hit those positions?" "Tower, rooftop, MG, western wall," I said. "Ranges between 1,400 and 1,500, all doable." "How fast?" 2 minutes prep, 60 seconds to drop all 3. "Then do it." I ranged each target, input the variables, set up my sequence in my head, tower first, gunner second, fighters third. Timing mattered. Every bullet was part of a sentence that had to end exactly right. "Ready," I whispered. The lieutenant gave a nod I could barely see. The first shot cracked through the cold air, tower sentry down. Bolt cycle, second shot, rooftop gunner collapsed. Third shot, the western wall lit up with confusion as their fighter dropped. "Three positions neutralized," I said calmly. "You're clear to move." Morrison's voice came alive. "Griffin 6, move, move, move." The SEALs sprinted down the slope. I stayed behind, my scope locked on the compound. The fog glowed white in the sunlight, beautiful, deceptive, the same way danger sometimes is. One enemy appeared on the roof, I fired. Another sprinted for the machine gun, I fired again. Every shot had purpose, every kill had weight. 15 minutes later, the compound was secure. No friendly losses. 11 enemy combatants down, most by my rifle. When Morrison found me at the extraction point, his expression had shifted from skepticism to something like respect. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, "you saved my team today. You made impossible shots look easy." I looked at him, then down at my rifle. "Nothing about it was easy, Lieutenant, just necessary." He nodded quietly. The choppers came in through the fatting fog, rotors thundering like judgment. As we lifted off the mountain, I looked out over the ridgelines I'd haunted for 3 days. The fog was already closing in again, erasing our footprints, our battle, our existence. It was like we'd never been there at all. But I knew better. Somewhere on a distant ridge, 2 lifeless rifles still pointed toward us, the only proof that the unseen can be the most powerful. And as the helicopter banked toward base, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, not pride, not victory, something quieter. Purpose. Because sometimes, the only way to protect others is to stay invisible yourself. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The rotor blades faded into the distance, swallowed by the same fog that had once hidden me. Back at base, everything felt louder, the hum of generators, the chatter of radio traffic, the small human noises you forget when you've been alone too long. They debriefed us under the pale light of the operations tent. The SEALs spoke first, precise, professional, their voices steady. When it was my turn, I simply handed over my logbook, every range, every wind shift, every kill confirmed. The colonel nodded as he read, but he didn't say much. He didn't need to. Numbers spoke their own language. Later, when I stepped outside, the night hit me with its silence. The air smelled like diesel and dust. Around the perimeter, guards moved like shadows under red lamps. I sat on a sandbag wall and cleaned my rifle, the same ritual I'd done after every mission. The bolt, the bore, the scope. Each piece wiped clean, reassembled, reset. I guess that's how I reset too, piece by piece. Lieutenant Morrison found me there. No helmet now, just a tired face and eyes that had seen too much for one day. He crouched beside me. "Hell of a shot back there," he said quietly. "Which one?" I asked. "All of them," he answered. "You turned a disaster into an extraction." I shrugged, still running the cloth through the barrel. "You'd have done the same." "Maybe, but we didn't even see the enemy." He paused. "You just appeared out of the fog like you were part of it." I didn't respond. Some moments don't need replies. He studied me for a while. "You always operate like that, alone, invisible." "Always. Doesn't it get to you?" "What?" "The isolation, the silence." I looked at the horizon, a faint line of black mountains against an orange sky. "You learn to make peace with it. Silence can be a weapon too." He nodded, though I could tell he didn't fully understand. Few do. That night sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the ridge, the brief flash of movement before a life ended. The math of it was clean. The morality wasn't. People think snipers don't feel. That distance dulls empathy. But distance only magnifies thought. You have time to think before you pull the trigger, time to imagine who they were, who's waiting for them to come home. And yet you still fire, because someone has to. 3 days passed before my next assignment. I spent most of it maintaining gear, checking data, studying wind patterns like they were scripture. Around base, the SEALs treated me differently now. Respectful, curious, but careful, like I was something they couldn't quite categorize. They called me the Fog. I heard it whispered once behind me, a half-joke that stuck. At first I thought it was ridiculous. Then I realized it fit. Fog hides, conceals, protects. It rolls in quiet, does its work, and disappears before dawn. Maybe that's all I was meant to be. On the fourth night, Colonel Richards called me into his office. The map table was lit, the terrain marked with red grease pencil. He didn't waste words. "Mitchell, you're redeploying with Morrison's team tomorrow. Similar terrain, higher stakes. Intelligence confirms enemy snipers operating in overlapping sectors. You'll insert separately, provide overwatch, and neutralize threats before the SEALs move in." I nodded, same parameters. Independent. No direct coordination until you make contact. They won't know you're there unless it's necessary. He paused, his expression softening. "You did exceptional work out there, Hadley. You saved lives, but solo operations take a toll. Don't lose sight of the line between solitude and isolation." I almost smiled. "With respect, sir, that line's the only thing that keeps me focused." He sighed, "Then keep it sharp." The next morning I was airborne again, low-light insertion, pre-dawn drop. The air at altitude was freezing, slicing through my gloves as I gripped the static line. Below, the mountains stretched out like the bones of the earth. When the light turned green, I jumped. The parachute bloomed above me, quiet, steady. For a moment, the world was nothing but wind and weightlessness. Then the ground rushed up to meet me, and solitude wrapped around me again like an old friend. I landed clean, packed my chute, and began the climb toward my first overwatch point. Hours later, I spotted the SEALs, a line of shadows moving through the valley. They didn't know I was there, but I watched their formation, the way they hugged the terrain, the way Morrison kept scanning the horizon. Professionals, every one of them. Then movement on the ridge. 3 faint flashes, the unmistakable echo of suppressed gunfire. I dropped prone instantly, rangefinder up, 1,980 meters, wind 6 miles per hour, firing angle 20 degrees downward. I dialed adjustments, breathed out and squeezed. First shot hit. Second, adjust 2 more right, fire again, hit. Third, delayed reaction, but the target slumped. "Overwatch to Griffin 6, I transmitted quietly. 3 enemy snipers neutralized. Northern ridge clear, proceed." Morrison's reply came seconds later. "Copy that, Overwatch, damn good timing." Timing, yes, luck maybe, but precision was earned. They advanced again, and I followed their progress from the heights. It was a strange companionship, protecting men who didn't even know where I was. Watching their lives hinge on fractions of a degree, ounces of pressure. As the day wore on, the mission deepened, a complex of huts, radio towers, armed guards. I provided cover fire twice more, each engagement brief and surgical. By nightfall, the operation was complete. No friendly casualties. When I finally rejoined them at the extraction zone, they greeted me with grins this time. Chief Carter handed me a canteen. "Ma'am or sergeant, whichever you prefer, we owe you more than 1 beer." I smiled faintly. "I don't drink." "Then we'll owe you a dozen coffees." Their laughter was easy, real. For a brief second, it almost felt like belonging. Almost. Back at base, Colonel Richards met me on the tarmac. 11 confirmed kills again, he said. "Exceptional. You're making this look effortless." "It's not," I replied quietly. "It just looks that way because I've learned to move slow." He nodded thoughtfully. "You know, word's spreading. Teams are talking about the woman sniper who appears from nowhere and leaves no trace. They're calling you the Fog officially now." I exhaled. "Then I guess the name stays." He studied me for a long moment. "You don't like attention, do you?" "No, sir." "Good," he said, "because attention is a liability." That night I lay awake staring at the canvas ceiling of my tent. The air was heavy, full of heat and dust. Outside, distant thunder rolled over the mountains. I thought about what Richard said about attention. He was right. The more people noticed you, the easier it was to target you physically or emotionally. That's why I built walls. Not the kind of walls you hide behind, but the kind that keep you steady when everything else breaks. But sometimes, I wondered if I'd built them too high. Weeks blurred together. Missions stacked one on top of another. Each one different in map coordinates but identical in rhythm, insertion, observation, calculation, elimination. I started to feel less like a person and more like a mechanism, something that existed only between the trigger press and the bullet's impact. Then came the mission that changed everything. It began with a briefing unlike any other. Richard stood by the map again, but this time his tone carried weight. "Sergeant, intelligence confirms a high-value commander operating out of this sector. He's been orchestrating attacks that cost us over 40 coalition lives. We have one confirmed window to eliminate him, 1,200 hours tomorrow." I leaned forward, studying the topography. Extraction routes. Minimal, the compound surrounded by hostile territory. Airstrike denied, civilian risk. But there's a vantage point here, he pointed to a narrow peak, at 2,800 meters from the target. My mind froze on the number, 2,800. He nodded. "We know it's extreme, maybe impossible, but if anyone can do it, it's you. If you think it's not feasible, we'll find another solution." I looked at the map again, the valley, the compound, the ridges between us. It wasn't impossible, just unforgiving. "Possible," I said, "but I'll need data, wind readings at multiple altitudes, temperature differentials, barometric pressure." "You'll have it." That night I didn't sleep. I calculated angles, drop rates, wind drift, Coriolis effect, numbers that kept looping through my head like prayers. But no formula can prepare you for the moment when math meets morality. At dawn, I was airborne again. Just me, my rifle, and a sky that looked too wide for one human to matter in. When the helicopter dropped me off, I was alone again. The pilot didn't even land, just hovered while I jumped. 6 hours to prepare for a shot that might never happen again. I found my perch on the ridge, 9,100 feet above sea level. From here, the world below looked small, like a diorama made of dust and light. I began the process. Rangefinder readings: 27842-791 2796. Average 2,795 meters. Wind at my position, 11 miles per hour, decreasing slightly toward the valley. I logged data every 500 meters of bullet path, adjusting for lateral drift. Temperature drop from ridge to valley 9 degrees Fahrenheit. Barometric pressure, elevation angle, all noted. 4 hours later I had my firing solution. 78.4 MOA elevation, 13.2 windage. Flight time, 4.3 seconds. 4 seconds. That's how long the bullet would travel before truth arrived. I set up, exhaled slowly, and waited. At 11:55, shapes began moving in the compound. At 12:02, I saw him, the commander. He stepped into the courtyard, surrounded by bodyguards, oblivious to the math that had already sealed his fate. My heart didn't race, it slowed. I took in a deep breath, found that small stillness between heartbeats, and pressed the trigger. The recoil felt distant. I stayed locked in the scope, tracking the bullet's arc across the valley. 4 seconds stretched into forever. Then impact. The man dropped. Through the glass, I saw chaos ripple across the compound, shouting, confusion, disbelief. I keyed my radio. Granite Base, Overwatch 1, target neutralized. range 2795 meters, one shot. Silence, then Colonel Richard's voice incredulous. Say again, Overwatch. Confirmed hit at 2795. A long pause, then outstanding work, extraction inbound. As I waited for the helicopter, I realized I'd just crossed a line, not the moral kind, but the invisible one between what people believe is possible and what truly is. And that realization didn't feel like triumph. It felt like responsibility. Because when you do the impossible once, they start expecting it again. When I returned to base, the air felt heavier. You could always tell when command knew something extraordinary had happened, not from the chatter but from the silence that followed it. People didn't make eye contact. Officers walked faster. Radios went quiet mid-transmission. It wasn't fear. It was awe. As the helicopter touched down, I could see the colonel waiting near the hangar, arms folded, expression unreadable. Beside him stood someone new, a woman in a starched uniform, her presence sharp as a blade. A two-star general. That's when I realized the shot had gone further than the bullet. Sergeant Mitchell, Colonel Richards called out as I stepped off the bird. Welcome back. I saluted, sir. General Patricia Stone, he said, motioning toward the woman. She's been briefed. The general's eyes held mine, curious, measured, skeptical, maybe even a little disbelieving. Sergeant, she said, I've read your report twice. Range 2795 meters. Yes, ma'am. She studied me, then the rifle strapped to my back. And you verified that range with laser confirmation. Multiple times, I replied, across 3 points. She exhaled slowly, the disbelief melting into something else, respect, maybe mixed with unease. That exceeds the longest recorded combat engagement by several hundred meters. Yes, ma'am. May I ask how you managed it? I hesitated. There was no poetic answer, just truth. Preparation, calculation, discipline, and a little luck. The general's lips curved slightly. Luck favors the trained, Sergeant, and you're being promoted to Sergeant First Class effective immediately. Congratulations. Her tone was calm, but her words felt like thunder. Promotions are supposed to feel like triumph. But to me, it felt like weight, a new rank sown with the cost of lives I'd taken to earn it. Thank you, ma'am. She turned to the colonel. I want her debriefed by our Advanced Ballistics Division and document everything, environmental factors, rifle configuration, firing position. We're going to study this. They left together, their voices fatting. I stood alone for a moment, the dust settling around my boots. The record didn't matter. The shot didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a message I hadn't yet decoded. That night I sat alone in the armory, disassembling my rifle piece by piece, bolt to barrel, scope to mount. Metal on metal, soft, rhythmic, meditative. Cleaning it was like atoning. Every soldier has their ritual for silence. This was mine. Hours later, Morrison found me. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, a faint grin cutting through his exhaustion. So it's true, he said. You hit that guy from 2,795 meters. I didn't look up. That's what the math says. Math, he chuckled softly. You're too modest. That's not math, that's art. Art implies beauty, I said. There's nothing beautiful about killing. He didn't argue, he just nodded, understanding. Still, you saved lives, mine included, again. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, a generator hummed, steady and low. You ever think about it afterward? He asked finally. Every time, I said. If you stop thinking about it, that's when you lose control. He nodded slowly, then reached into his vest pocket. The guys wanted you to have this. He handed me a small patch, black, embroidered with a simple outline of a cloud, barely visible unless the light hit it right. Below it one word, fog. I almost laughed. You made it official. He grinned. You earned it. I turned the patch over in my hand. It wasn't pride I felt, just recognition. Maybe this was who I was now, a shadow in vapor form. 2 days later, I was summoned back to Colonel Richard's office. He was sitting with a folder open, its pages full of graphs and range data. "Hadley," he said, dropping the formal tone, "we're reassigning you." "To where?" "Task Force Talon, Specialized Operations Unit, focused on extreme long-range engagements and sniper development. They want you to help train other shooters, share your methodology, develop advanced doctrine." Training, teaching others how to kill better, it made sense. And yet, something in me recoiled. "With respect, sir," I said quietly, "I'm not sure I'm the right teacher." "You are," he said firmly. "You've pushed the limits of what's possible, and whether you realize it or not, you've changed the way we think about precision warfare." He closed the folder and leaned back. "You'll also continue field operations as needed, high-priority missions only." "Solo?" He hesitated. "For now, yes, until they assign a partner or observer." A partner. The word didn't sit right. I'd worked alone so long, I wasn't sure I remembered how to share space with another heartbeat. "Yes, sir," I said finally. He nodded. "You've done good work, Sergeant. Get some rest. You leave in 48 hours." But rest never came. My mind kept looping back to that shot. The perfect wind, the perfect math, the perfect silence after impact. And the hollow that followed it. The next day, Morrison and his team requested to see me before redeploying. I met them in the hangar just before their flight. The atmosphere was lighter than before. Jokes, handshakes, the kind of laughter only people who have faced death can truly share. When they saw me, conversation stopped for a beat. Then Morrison spoke. "Sergeant Mitchell," he said, "we just wanted to thank you. You appeared out of nowhere, saved our team, made shots we thought were impossible." Carter added, "And that 2,795-meter kill, that's not just a record, that's legend. You've set a standard the rest of us will spend years chasing." I smiled faintly. "Records don't matter, Chief, lives do." He nodded. "That's exactly why it matters." One of the younger SEALs, barely old enough to rent a car back home, looked at me with wide eyes. "Ma'am, is it true they're calling you the Fog?" I laughed softly. "That's what I hear." "Well," he said, "it fits. You show up out of nowhere, fix everything, then vanish before anyone realizes what happened." Morrison smirked. "Except Fog doesn't shoot half a mile through solid wind." I shook my head. "Fog moves quiet, that's enough." They boarded the helicopter, each one offering a nod as they passed. And when the bird lifted off, I felt something strange, a twinge of emptiness, like I was watching a part of myself fly away. Because maybe, for a moment, I hadn't been alone. 2 days later, I deployed again, this time with Task Force Talon. They operated differently. Less noise, more precision, fewer egos. These weren't soldiers chasing glory, they were scientists of lethality. I spent weeks training them, long hours on the range, dissecting ballistics equations, explaining humidity drift and spin drift, teaching them how to read mirage and terrain like language. They listened not because I was special, but because they'd seen the numbers. 2,795 meters, a distance that shouldn't be possible. But even as I taught them, I started to question what I was creating. Was I building better protectors, or more efficient killers? One evening, after a training session, a young corporal approached me. He was quiet, analytical, the kind of mind that would make an exceptional sniper. "Sergeant," he said, "how do you stay calm when you pull the trigger, knowing what's at the other end?" I looked at him for a long time. He expected a clean answer. There wasn't one. "You don't stay calm," I said finally. "You stay deliberate. Calm means detached. Deliberate means responsible." He frowned slightly, processing that. "So you think about it?" "Always." He nodded slowly. "That sounds heavy." "It is," I said softly, But if it ever stops feeling heavy, stop pulling the trigger." He didn't reply, just nodded once and walked away. I hoped he understood. Later that night, I sat outside the barracks, staring at the stars. They looked sharp, almost surgical in their distance, cold, perfect, unfeeling. That's the paradox of this life. The farther you're shot, the closer you get to what's human. Distance doesn't dull the soul, it stretches it. Weeks passed. Missions came and went. I executed 3 more Overwatch operations, each at extreme range. Each time the shots were clean, efficient, necessary. Each time the silence afterward felt deeper. And somewhere between those missions, the fog became more than a nickname. It became a myth. They whispered it in briefing rooms, mentioned it over radio channels. Some believed I was real. Others thought I was a story, a ghost sniper the task force invented to boost morale. I didn't correct them. Maybe it was better that way. Because myths can't be targeted. But soldiers can. And when you become a myth, it's easy to forget there's still a heartbeat beneath it. I was starting to. Until the next mission reminded me why I'd started all this in the first place. Not for medals or records or myths, but because someone had to see the things no one else wanted to see and still pull the trigger when it mattered. The world was full of fog. I just learned how to move through it without losing my way. Or at least, that's what I told myself. How many miles does it take before you stop feeling human? I used to think distance protected me, that the farther I was from the shot, the safer I was from the weight of it. But the truth is, distance doesn't dull anything, it magnifies it. You see the world more clearly from 2,000 meters away. Every movement, every hesitation, every fragile second before impact. That clarity is both a gift and a curse. By the 4th month of deployment, the fog had become something larger than me, a rumor whispered between units, a ghost story told in mess halls. The sniper who appeared out of nowhere, saved entire teams and vanished before dawn. Command leaned into it. They let the legend grow because legends motivate soldiers. They make them believe in things beyond procedure and protocol. But for me, it wasn't a legend. It was just another name to hide behind. Another mask to wear when the real one started to crack. My days fell into a rhythm: operations, training, Overwatch, silence. I taught new shooters during daylight, and at night I practiced alone. Lying prone in the dirt, breathing with the wind, aligning scope and target until the world narrowed to one perfect point. Perfection is seductive. It disguises obsession as discipline. And somewhere in that pursuit, I started losing the line between who I was and what I did. One evening, after a long day on the range, I was summoned to a secure briefing room. The walls were bare, the air too still. Colonel Richards was there, and beside him, General Stone again. "Sergeant First Class Mitchell," she began, her tone neutral but sharp. "We have a situation developing in Sector Delta. A recon patrol was ambushed yesterday, 3 killed, 2 missing. Satellite confirms heavy insurgent presence, multiple snipers operating from the ridge line." I nodded slowly. "You want me to locate and neutralize?" "Yes," she said, "but not alone this time. You'll have a spotter." I froze. "A spotter?" She exchanged a glance with the colonel. "Staff Sergeant Liam Hayes. He's one of your trainees. He's good, top marks in wind reading, stable under pressure. He'll be your second." I didn't argue, but I didn't like it either. Solo meant control, predictability, silence. Adding another heartbeat meant risk, not just tactically but emotionally. Still, orders were orders. We deployed the next morning. A dawn insertion, low visibility, moderate crosswinds, the kind of weather that felt like a warning. Hayes was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that meant he was trying not to disappoint me. "You don't need to act like I'm a ghost," I said as we hiked. He glanced at me. "You kind of are, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am, call me Mitchell." "Yes, Ma," he caught himself. "Yes, Sergeant." We climbed in silence for hours. By midday, we reached our observation point overlooking the valley. The enemy compound was visible through the haze, small, distant, crawling with movement. "Range?" I asked. He lifted his rangefinder. 1950 to the southern perimeter, 2035 to the main structure. "Good, log it." We spent the next 6 hours observing patterns, guard shifts, wind changes. It was the kind of patience that drives some people mad. But for me, stillness was home. When the first enemy sniper revealed himself on the opposite ridge, Hayes spotted him first. 2010 meters, west slope behind the boulder, he whispered. I found the target through my scope. Good eyes, wind. 7 miles per hour from northwest. Angle, -3 degrees. Elevation, 8,700 feet. He rattled off the data cleanly. For a moment I almost smiled. You've been listening. I had a good teacher. I adjusted my turret, aligned crosshairs, and fired. The recoil jolted my shoulder, but the bullet flew true. 3 seconds later, the figure on the ridge slumped forward. Hayes exhaled audibly. Impact confirmed. Log it, I said, and start scanning for his partner. Over the next hour, we neutralized 3 more shooters. The mission was precise, surgical, silent. No SEALs lost this time. But something unexpected happened that night, after we'd exfiltrated to our hide site. As we sat beneath a camouflage net, sharing a ration pack and the kind of tiredness that makes conversation easier, Hayes looked at me and said quietly, "How do you do it?" "Do what?" "Keep doing this without breaking." I stared into the dark for a long time. The question wasn't new, but hearing it from him made it feel heavier. "You don't stay unbroken," I said finally. "You just learn to live with the cracks." He nodded slowly, understanding more than he let on. The next morning, we were extracted without incident. The mission was declared a success, but something had shifted. Working with Hayes had reminded me what it felt like to share silence, and that scared me more than any bullet ever could. A week later, I was back at the range, alone again. Hayes had been reassigned to another task group. That should have been a relief, but instead it left an echo. Every time I adjusted my scope, I heard his voice in my head. Wind 7 northwest. It's strange. You can go months without human connection, then miss it like oxygen once it's gone. That's when the dream started. The fog, the ridges, the slow, inevitable countdown of a bullet in flight. But this time when the target fell, it wasn't an enemy. It was Hayes. I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the echo of that impact ringing in my skull. War has many forms. Some you fight outside, some you fight alone in the dark. 2 weeks later, General Stone returned to base. The 2,795-meter shot had gone viral through classified channels. Analysts, ballistic experts, even foreign units were studying the report. She wanted me to brief a room full of generals on the psychology of extreme-range engagement. They wanted science. What they got was honesty. I stood in front of them and said, at 2,000 meters, you stop aiming at a person. You aim at a prediction. You pull the trigger and trust that your math is more loyal than your doubt. But when the shot lands, when the body drops, the math doesn't stay with you. The silence does. No one spoke for several seconds. Then one of them asked, "Would you do it again?" "Yes," I said, "but I'd think about it longer." Later, as the room emptied, General Stone caught me by the shoulder. "You understand what you're doing, don't you?" she said quietly. "You're redefining limits. You're showing the world what's possible." I looked at her. And what happens when what's possible becomes expected? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, I sat alone on the runway, watching helicopters lift off into the desert night. Their lights blinked like tiny constellations of war, each one carrying soldiers chasing orders they might not understand until it's too late. I used to think that precision was purity, that hitting your target meant control. But the more perfect my shots became, the less human they felt. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't fighting enemies anymore. I was fighting the distance itself, the invisible space between right and necessary. Weeks turned into months. I supported more missions, trained more snipers, and buried more silence in my chest. And through it all, the fog kept spreading. Teams would whisper it before deploying, like a prayer, like superstition. May the fog be with us. It was absurd and beautiful and tragic all at once. Because they didn't know that the fog was just a woman trying to remember what warmth felt like. One night after a long operation, I received an encrypted message. Short, simple, chilling. One of ours captured, coordinates attached. It was Hayes. The next mission wasn't planned, it wasn't authorized, it was instinct. I didn't wait for approval, I just moved. Solo insertion, high altitude, 3 days of tracking. Every sign pointed to a remote outpost deep in hostile territory. When I finally found it, I saw him bound, bruised, alive. 2 guards nearby, laughing. I ranged, adjusted, and fired. 2 rounds, 2 kills. Then I moved. By the time I reached Hayes, he was barely conscious. I cut his restraints and whispered, "You're not done yet, soldier." He tried to speak, but his voice broke. "You came alone." "Always," I said. We moved through the night, step by step, until the extraction chopper arrived. The rotors cut through the fog like salvation. When we finally lifted off, Hayes looked at me through half-lidded eyes. "You're really not human," he whispered weakly. I smiled faintly. "Neither are you, not tonight." He lived, but something in me changed that day. Saving him felt heavier than killing ever did. It reminded me that the same precision that ends lives can also protect them, if you aim for the right reason. When we landed back at base, command was furious. Unauthorized mission, protocol breach, risking assets. But then they saw the intel I'd pulled from that outpost, maps, coordinates, comms data. It dismantled an entire network. They called it a victory, I called it penance. As I walked out of the debriefing room, Colonel Richards stopped me. "You realize," he said quietly, "you've just become untouchable." "Untouchable?" I asked. He nodded. "You've done too much, seen too much. You've crossed into legend, Hadley." Legend, the word tasted like ash. Because legends don't get to be people anymore. And for the first time in years, I wondered if disappearing into the fog was freedom or exile. They say legends don't feel fear. But that's a lie. Fear isn't the absence of courage. It's the reminder that you're still human. And being human was something I was starting to forget. After the rescue mission, command treated me differently. The reprimand I expected never came. Instead, they sent commendations, another medal, another line in a report that would never be released to the public. The kind of praise that sounds hollow when you know what it cost. Hayes was recovering in medical. He'd live, but they were pulling him from field duty. Too much trauma, they said. I wondered if they meant physical or moral. I didn't ask. I visited him once before he shipped home. He looked smaller somehow, like the mountains had taken something from him that no one could return. "You didn't have to come for me," he said quietly. "I did," I replied. "You would have done the same." He smiled faintly. "You always think you're saving someone, but every time you pull that trigger, part of you disappears too." I didn't answer because he wasn't wrong. When I left his room, I caught my reflection in the glass. Tired eyes, skin pale from weeks without sunlight, the kind of face that doesn't look 30 anymore, just weathered. That was the last time I saw him. After that, I went back to what I did best, disappearing into the fog. But something had changed. The missions kept coming, but they felt different now. Each briefing sounded like déjà vu, coordinates, threats, target, confirmation. Yet behind the clinical language, I started hearing something else. Expectation. They didn't ask if I could make the shot anymore. They asked how far. I had become a measurement, a range, a number that defied limits. And when you become the standard, failure stops being an option. Weeks blurred into months. I operated in 6 different sectors, sometimes solo, sometimes paired with teams that looked at me like I was more myth than soldier. They wanted to see it, the impossible shot, the calm under pressure, the ghost who never missed. They wanted the story. But stories don't feel the cold when you lie in a hide for 30 hours without moving. They don't feel the cramps, the hunger, the loneliness. Stories don't bleed when the mission ends. People do. One night after another long overwatch, I was sitting alone in the observation post, writing in my field journal, something I did rarely but needed that night. I wrote one line. Precision is easy, peace is not. The next morning, Colonel Richards called me into his tent. His voice was softer than usual. You've been extended for another rotation. Voluntary, of course. Voluntary, the word meant nothing. They knew I wouldn't refuse. I nodded. How many operations? 4, maybe 5. High priority. You'll be our long-range overwatch for joint coalition teams. They requested you specifically. Because of the myth. He gave a faint smile. Because of the results. I didn't argue. The myth had become a tool, one that saved lives, yes, but also trapped me inside it. The first of those missions took place in a mountain pass near the border. Thin air, high winds, and a valley so deep it looked like the earth had split itself open. I spent 2 days crawling into position, my body pressed against frozen stone, fingers numb, breath fogging the scope. Through the glass, I saw a convoy armed trucks escorting an enemy commander known for brutality. He was my target. Range, 2,230 meters. Wind, unpredictable, swirling. Visibility, poor. The conditions were wrong. Every sniper knows when not to take the shot, but command wanted confirmation. They wanted a result. I waited 3 hours for wind stability, then another hour for a clear sight picture. When the moment came, I exhaled, steadied, and fired. Impact confirmed. But the bullet didn't just find him. It found something else, something buried deep inside me that woke up again. Because when the convoy erupted into chaos and I watched men scatter like shadows under fire, I didn't feel triumph. I felt nothing. And that terrified me more than missing ever could. When you stop feeling, you stop being accountable to yourself. That night I sat under the stars, wrapped in a thermal blanket, staring at the rifle beside me. My hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the emptiness. I remembered Hayes's words, "Every time you pull that trigger, part of you disappears too." Maybe that was it. Maybe I'd finally run out of pieces. The next day, I sent my after-action report, clean, clinical, precise, just the way they wanted it. But I added one last line that no one asked for. Recommend reassignment, equipment still functional, operator uncertain. No one mentioned that line in the debrief. No one ever does. 2 weeks later, General Stone visited again. She arrived unannounced, her uniform crisp, her tone as cold as the air outside. "Mitchell," she said, "your results have reached the top. They're calling you the best long-range operator in the field. There's talk of assigning you to special demonstration roles, training, research, maybe even public relations." I almost laughed. "You want me to give speeches?" She didn't flinch. "People need to believe in capability. You represent what's possible." "What about what's ethical?" I asked quietly. That caught her off guard. Meaning. Every time we push the line further, we make killing easier. We turn precision into progress. "Sergeant," she said firmly, "progress saves lives." I looked at her, and what happens when it stops doing that? She didn't answer, she just straightened her posture. "We adapt." Then she left. That night I couldn't sleep. The barracks were quiet, the kind of silence that feels like a weight pressing on your chest. I stepped outside, barefoot on cold sand, and stared at the horizon. The fog was rolling in again, slow and deliberate, swallowing everything in its path. It was beautiful, tragic, familiar. And for the first time in years, I felt small. The fog doesn't judge. It doesn't remember. It simply exists, moving where it's pulled, dissolving when it's done. Maybe that's why I understood it so well. Maybe that's why I had become it. A few days later, I received an encrypted message marked Urgent Task Force Alpha. I opened it. The coordinates hit me instantly. Same sector where I'd first met Morrison and his SEAL team. The message was short. Requesting overwatch. Hostile buildup detected. Potential HVT in area. Mission priority critical. I didn't hesitate. When the helicopter lifted off that night, the pilot looked back at me. "You going solo again, ma'am?" I nodded, always. The air outside was cold and sharp. I closed my eyes as the rotors thundered overhead, carrying me back to the same mountains, the same ghosts. When I parachuted into the darkness, I landed within a mile of where I'd made my first 2,000-meter shot. The terrain hadn't changed, but I had. I moved through the fog like it was muscle memory. Every rock, every hollow, every echo of the past still lingering in the air. When dawn broke, I reached my position and scanned the valley below. Sure enough, the SEALs were there, pinned again under heavy fire. Same pattern, same chaos. Except this time, I wasn't invisible. They saw me before I wanted them to. Morrison's voice came over the radio, shocked and relieved. "Overwatch, that you?" "It's me," I said quietly. There was a pause, then his voice softened. "Good to hear you again, Fog." "Let's finish what we started," I said. Through my scope, I saw the ridge enemy snipers in perfect position, firing down at the SEALs. 3 of them, maybe 4. Range 1,980. Wind steady. Easy math. I adjusted my scope, exhaled, and fired. One after another, clean, surgical final. Morrison's voice came back over comms. "Targets down. Damn, Mitchell, you just saved us again." I didn't answer. I just watched the fog drift across the ridge, carrying the echoes away. After the operation, as the team regrouped at extraction, Morrison approached me. His uniform was dusty, his eyes tired but alive. "You still working alone?" he asked. "Trying to." He nodded. "You ever think about stopping?" "Every day." "Then why don't you?" I looked at the valley below, silent now, peaceful for once. "Because someone has to keep the silence honest." He smiled faintly, but there was sadness in it. "You know, I think I finally get it, why they call you the Fog." "Why that?" "Because you're there when we need you, and gone when we don't. But somehow, it always feels colder when you leave." I didn't reply. Some truths don't need words. When the helicopter lifted off, I looked out over the mountains one last time. The fog was thinning, drifting upward like smoke. And for a fleeting moment, I wondered if disappearing completely would finally bring peace, or just make me another ghost in a story no one believes. The engine roared, the ground fell away. And all I could think was, maybe that's the point. Maybe legends aren't meant to live forever. They're meant to remind the living what it costs to keep believing. There's a strange thing that happens when people start believing you're invincible. You stop being allowed to feel human. After the mission with Morrison's team, I was flown back to command. There were no celebrations, no speeches, just silence, the kind that fills rooms when even respect feels too heavy. Colonel Richards met me outside the hangar. He didn't say congratulations. He just handed me a sealed folder marked classified, EYES only. Inside were 2 pages, new orders, another deployment, another mountain, another set of coordinates that would probably never leave my memory. "Didn't even give me time to breathe," I said quietly. He looked at me, guilt flickering behind his steady gaze. We don't have anyone else who can do what you do, Hadley. Maybe that's the problem. He sighed. You know what happens if you stop. Someone else pays the price. He wasn't wrong, but that didn't make it easier. I turned and walked toward my gear. My rifle waited on the workbench, cold, silent, faithful. The only constant in a world that kept shifting under my feet. As I cleaned it, I caught my reflection in the scope's glass. For a second, I didn't recognize the eyes staring back. They looked like someone who'd forgotten what normal felt like. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear Morrison's voice echoing through the radio. It always feels colder when you leave. He didn't mean it literally, but he was right. I brought cold with me, not the kind that freezes the skin, but the kind that settles inside, where warmth used to live. 2 nights later, I was airborne again. The chopper door was open, wind tearing through the cabin. The landscape below was a sea of black ridges, their peaks hidden under layers of white mist. 2 minutes to drop zone, the crew chief shouted. I nodded, clipped in, and waited. When the green light blinked, I jumped. For a moment I was weightless, suspended between earth and sky, falling through the same fog that had named me. Then the chute opened, and gravity found me again. The landing was hard but clean. I packed the chute, shouldered my rifle, and began the long climb toward the observation ridge. It took 6 hours to reach it, 6 hours of silence, broken only by the crunch of gravel and my own breathing. When I finally set up my position, the valley below looked almost peaceful. But peace in this world was always camouflage. Through the scope, I saw them, a convoy of armored vehicles, dozens of fighters moving in and out of an old stone compound. Intel said their commander was responsible for ambushes that had killed over 30 of ours. I ranged the target area, 2,340 meters. Wind, inconsistent, swirling left to right. Temperature, 46 degrees F. Barometric pressure, dropping. Everything told me to wait, but command was impatient. Overwatch 1, this is base. Confirm eyes on target. Affirmative, I replied. Rules of engagement cleared. Eliminate HVT when possible. Possible, that word always carried too much weight. I adjusted, settled behind the scope, and waited for my breathing to slow. Minutes turned into hours. The fog thickened, then thinned, like it was breathing with me. Finally, he appeared, the commander. Surrounded by bodyguards, confident, unaware that a woman half a mile above him was already aligning his end. I found the holdover, adjusted for wind drift, and squeezed. The bullet flew, 3 seconds. Then impact. Through the glass I saw the body fall backward. The men around him froze, confused, then scattered. Base target neutralized, I said. My voice didn't even tremble. The radio crackled. Copy that, excellent work. Excellent work, 2 words that used to mean something. Now they just sounded like habit. When I exfiltrated the next morning, I moved slower than usual. My knees ached, my shoulders screamed from carrying 70 pounds of gear, and for the first time I felt tired. Not physically, something deeper. Back at base, Richards was waiting. Clean shot, he said. Clean doesn't mean right, I muttered. He frowned. You're burning out, Hadley. Maybe, I said, or maybe I'm just seeing clearly for once. He hesitated. You want to take leave? I can make that happen. I looked at him. What would I do on leave? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. We both knew I had no home waiting, no family, no life outside the scope. The fog doesn't go on leave. It just lingers until it's needed again. The days that followed felt heavier. I found myself staring at the rifle longer before missions. My hands would hover over it, like I was asking permission to keep using it. And the dreams came back louder, clearer. Every face I'd ever shot, every voice I'd silenced, they didn't accuse me, they just watched waiting for me to admit something I couldn't yet name. Then one night, something unexpected happened. I was sitting in the mess tent, half listening to a news feed playing on a small television in the corner. The story showed footage from a training facility, a new generation of snipers learning advanced ballistic modeling. One of them held a rifle nearly identical to mine. The caption read, "New tactical doctrine inspired by record-setting sniper engagement." My engagement, my data, my life. They'd turned me into curriculum. I watched as the instructor, a man I'd never met, explained my shot to a class of recruits. She compensated for crosswind and gravitational drop over nearly 3,000 meters. It's an extraordinary example of discipline and math under stress. No mention of the silence that followed. No mention of the cost. I turned the TV off. That night I walked out to the firing range alone. The sky was clear, the moon sharp against the dark. I set up a single target at 800 meters, child's play compared to my usual distances, and took a position. But I didn't fire, I just looked through the scope. For hours, the crosshairs rested perfectly on the center of that distant shape. My breathing slowed, my finger on the trigger. And for the first time I didn't feel control, I felt nothing. No anger, no focus, no fear, just an emptiness that scared me more than any enemy could. That's when I realized something. I could make any shot on Earth, except the one that mattered most. The one that would let me stop. The next morning I went to see Richards. He looked surprised to see me so early. "I want reassignment," I said. He frowned. "You just came off a mission." "I'm not asking for another one. I'm asking to be done." He stared at me, silent for a long time. "You know that's not how this works. You've become integral to our operational capability. You're part of our doctrine now." "Doctrine," I said bitterly. "I'm a person, not a formula." He stood, his voice low. "Hadley, I can't lose you. None of us can." "You already have," I said quietly. "You just don't know it yet." I turned and walked out. That night I packed my gear. Rifle, journal, minimal rations, I left the rest. No orders, no comms, just coordinates of where I wanted to go back to the mountains. The same ones that had built me, broken me, and hidden me. I left before dawn. No one tried to stop me. Maybe they knew better. Maybe they finally understood. As I hiked into the fog again, I felt the silence close around me like a familiar coat. Every breath hurt, but in that pain, there was clarity. For years, I had chased perfection in the name of duty. But perfection isn't peace. It's the illusion that control can save you. The truth is simpler. You don't control anything. Not the wind, not the bullet, not the outcome. You only control the intention behind the shot. And mine had been lost somewhere between orders and myth. I reached the same ridge where it all began, the place where I first revealed myself to the SEALs, the place where the fog was born. The wind sounded the same. The light hit the rocks in the same way. For a moment, it felt like time hadn't moved at all. I set my rifle down beside me, sat cross-legged and just listened. No radios, no commands, no numbers, just wind. I stayed there until night fell. The fog rolled in slow, curling around me, soft as breath. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of it. I closed my eyes and whispered to the silence, "I'm still here." The wind answered not with words, but with something gentler. "Forgiveness." Maybe that's what peace really is. Not the absence of noise, but the acceptance of it. And as the fog thickened, wrapping the mountains in its quiet hands, I finally understood something I'd spent years running from. Sometimes the only way to find yourself is to disappear. Fog and silence. That's what I woke to, not the sound of rotors, not the buzz of radios. Just wind whispering through pine and stone. Days passed before I realized I was counting them again. Not missions, not kills, just days. It's strange how stillness feels violent after years of motion. I'd spent so long chasing targets that standing still felt like betrayal. But the mountains don't ask questions. They just exist, patient, ancient, unbothered by human noise. I built a small camp on the ridge, a fire pit hidden under rock, a tarp stretched low to block drone heat signatures, old habits I couldn't unlearn. The rifle stayed sealed in its case. I told myself it was temporary, but part of me already knew I didn't want to touch it again. At first I listened for helicopters, footsteps, voices, but no one came. Maybe they didn't look for me. Or maybe they did, and realized finding a ghost was pointless. The first week I spoke out loud just to hear a voice again. Simple things, weather reports to myself, coordinates of clouds, warnings to no one. It sounds insane, but solitude needs sound to stay real. I started hiking farther every morning, mapping old trails, following streams, sketching terrain. The soldier in me cataloged everything. The human in me was trying to remember what beauty looked like when it wasn't part of a target grid. One morning, while crossing a narrow ridge, I found something unexpected, a village. Tiny, maybe 20 houses. Smoke rising from stone chimneys, children chasing a worn soccer ball through the dust. They looked up as I approached, a woman in camouflage, a rifle slung but silent. Fear flickered first, then curiosity. An older man walked out from a doorway, weathered and thin. He said something I didn't understand, but his tone wasn't hostile. I raised both hands, showing I wasn't a threat. He pointed toward the fog-covered peaks behind me, then to the valley, then pressed his hand to his chest. A question without words. I nodded, I'm just passing through. He studied me for a moment, then motioned toward his house. Food, water, refuge. I hesitated, then followed. That night I ate real food for the first time in weeks, bread, lentils, tea that tasted like earth and memory. The man's wife smiled at me, her eyes kind in a way I hadn't seen in years. They didn't ask questions about the uniform or the rifle. Maybe they'd seen too many wars to care which side anyone was on anymore. Their children peeked from behind the doorway, giggling, whispering. One brave enough to approach offered me a carved wooden bird, small, imperfect, beautiful. I turned it over in my hands. Did you make this? He nodded proudly. Then you're an artist, I said. He didn't understand the words, but he smiled anyway. That night, as I sat outside under a cold sky, I realized I'd forgotten what human kindness felt like when it wasn't built on survival. These people lived surrounded by the same war that had consumed my world, and yet they still built, still shared, still laughed. They weren't ghosts. They were proof that life continued even when the world burned. I stayed 2 days, helping where I could, repairing a broken radio, hauling water, patching a roof with supplies from my pack. The kids started calling me something in their language that sounded like veil. Later, I learned it meant mist. It made me smile. Even here the fog followed me. When I left, the old man handed me a pouch of dried herbs. For cold nights, he said in broken English. Then he placed his hand on his heart again. Peace. It had been years since I'd heard that word without irony. For weeks after, I wandered the high valleys, staying close enough to civilization to see its smoke, far enough to stay invisible. Every sunrise looked the same, gray light spilling over endless stone, painting everything in shades of forgiveness. I started writing again, not reports, not coordinates, thoughts, memories, questions I couldn't ask anyone else. If you disappear long enough, do you stop being missed, or do you stop deserving to be? Is silence freedom, or just a slower kind of prison? I didn't know the answers. Maybe I never would. One afternoon, as I followed a ridgeline trail, I spotted something glinting in the dirt, a piece of metal, half-buried, corroded with age. I brushed off the dust. It was a spent casing, .338 caliber, my caliber. Mine, from months ago, maybe even years. The mountains had kept it, like a reminder. I sat there for a long time, turning it between my fingers, feeling its weight lighter than guilt, heavier than peace. That's when I realized what the mountains had been trying to tell me. The past doesn't vanish. It just waits for you to stop running. That night I built a small cairn of stones on that ridge and placed the casing at its center, not as a memorial, as an acknowledgement, a truth marker. Every myth leaves something behind. A few weeks later, I started hearing distant engines again, helicopters, drones, the hum of modern war echoing through the valleys. Word must have reached them. The fog had vanished and command wanted its ghost back. I kept moving higher, into places maps stopped caring about. The nights grew colder, the silence heavier. But with each step I felt something uncoil inside me, a thread of tension loosening. One morning, while gathering water from a stream, I saw a reflection that startled me. My own face, but softer, different. The eyes still carried the distance, but the anger was gone. I whispered to the reflection, "You're still here." The wind answered with a sigh. Weeks later, I found a cave near the summit, deep, hidden, shielded from aerial view. I made it home, not forever, but for now. The radio I carried, old, military grade, still functional, stayed off for days. Then, one evening, I turned it on. Static filled the cave like old ghosts trying to speak. Then a voice broke through, faint, uncertain. "Overwatch, this is Griffin 6. If you're out there, we still remember you." Morrison. My throat tightened. He paused, then continued, "I don't know if this signal's even reaching you, but the boys, they still talk about you, about how you showed up when no one else could. We don't need the legend, just hope you're alive, that's all." Then silence. I sat there for a long time, staring at the radio. The fog outside the cave drifted through the entrance like breath. Alive? Yes, but what did being alive mean, when the world only knew you as a ghost? The next morning, I packed my gear, not to go back, but to move closer to where the signal had come from. When I reached the ridge overlooking their new forward base, I stayed in the shadows, watching. There they were, Morrison, Carter, and the rest of the team, unloading supplies, preparing for another mission. I could have gone down, could have walked up to them, said my name, ended the mystery. But I didn't. They built their strength on the idea of the fog, a reminder that someone was watching over them. That belief made them braver. Maybe that was enough. I raised the radio, pressed transmit, and said softly, "Griffin 6, this is Overwatch." There was a pause, then Morrison's voice cracked through, shocked and alive with emotion. "Overwatch, my God," we thought. "I'm still here," I said, "just not where I used to be." He laughed, relief bleeding through static. "We never stopped talking about you. You're still our ghost." "Then let me stay that way," I said quietly. "Ghosts don't get in the way." He hesitated. "You sure?" "Tell your men." I paused, looking out across the ridges, the morning fog rolling like an ocean below us. "Tell them the fog hasn't gone. It's just learned to rest." Silence, then softly, "Copy that, Overwatch." I turned the radio off and slipped it back into my pack. The wind carried his voice away, scattering it into the mist like memory. For the first time in a long time, I smiled. Not the sharp, defensive kind soldiers wear, but something quieter. Peace, I realized, doesn't come when the world stops needing you. It comes when you stop needing the world to understand you. I spent that day watching the valley breathe, sunlight cutting through fog, mountains rising out of shadow. It was perfect in its imperfection, uncontrolled, unmeasured. I used to think my purpose ended when the missions did, but maybe purpose isn't something you finish. Maybe it's something you learn to carry differently. The rifle stayed in its case. I didn't need it anymore. And as dusk fell, I whispered into the quiet. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The fog rolled in thicker then, wrapping the mountains in silver. And for once, I didn't feel like disappearing into it. I felt like part of it. They say the mountains remember everything. The footsteps, the echoes, the stories whispered into their fog. If that's true, then somewhere in this vast silence, the mountains remember me. It's been months now, maybe longer. Time doesn't move the same way up here. The sun rises, the fog drifts, and I watch it all like an observer in someone else's dream. Every morning I wake before dawn, not because I need to, but because I want to see the world before it starts pretending again. There's a purity in that moment, the thin light cutting through mist, the cold air carrying no sound but its own breath. It's the only time of day that feels honest. I boil water over the small stove, the hiss of the flame the only conversation left. The journal beside me has grown thick, filled with words I'll probably never let anyone read. Thoughts, confessions, fragments of what it means to live between visibility and oblivion. Sometimes I wonder if disappearing was cowardice. Sometimes I think it was mercy. Back at command, they've probably written my file as missing, presumed dead. The legend of the fog will fade, replaced by new myths, new soldiers, new ghosts to believe in. That's how it should be. Because legends aren't supposed to last forever. They're meant to teach something before they vanish. I remember the first time I pulled a trigger. I remember the first time I wished I hadn't. And I remember every silent apology that followed. Those moments don't haunt me anymore. They live with me, quiet, accepted, forgiven in the way old wounds stop aching when the weather changes. I've learned that redemption isn't about erasing what you did. It's about living in a way that honors what it cost. There's a stream not far from my cave. The water runs clear even in winter, melting from ice that's older than history. I spend hours there, watching how it moves, relentless but never forceful. It doesn't fight the rocks, it shapes them patiently over years. Maybe that's what healing really is. Not erasing the scars, just softening them until they become part of the landscape. Sometimes I still hear distant thunder, gunfire echoing across valleys too far to see. The war hasn't ended. Wars never do. They just change shape, change names, move their borders like restless ghosts. But I don't move toward the sound anymore. Not out of fear, out of understanding. You can't silence violence with precision. You can only outlast it with presence. Every so often the radio still hums to life. Static. Then a voice, Morrison sometimes, or one of the newer operators. They still use the old call sign, Overwatch. Fog, if you're still out there, just know we're keeping your wind discipline alive. Or, made a 2,000-meter hit today. You'd have been proud. I smile when I hear them. I never answer. Some stories are better left unfinished. They keep people reaching higher. But once a message came through that stopped me cold. A voice I didn't recognize. Young, nervous, grateful. "This is Valkyrie 2, she said. "New long-range unit. They told us about you, the woman who walked out of fog and never missed. I don't know if you can hear me, ma'am, but thank you. You made it possible for us to believe we could do this too." The transmission ended there. I sat for a long time afterward, the radio still warm in my hands, thinking about that word believe. Belief, that's all I'd ever really given anyone. Not glory, not victory, just permission to believe that courage can come quietly. That maybe strength isn't measured by how many you can defeat, but by how much you can endure without becoming what you fight. That night, I wrote one last line in my journal. If I'm remembered at all, let it be for the silence I kept, not the shots I fired. The next morning, the fog came heavier than usual, a white sea swallowing the peaks, erasing the horizon. I stepped outside and stood in it, letting it wrap around me like an old friend. It felt like coming home. Every drop of moisture on my skin carried a memory, laughter, loss, promises made under gunfire, faces I never got to see again. And in that swirl of light and vapor, I understood something final. I wasn't escaping the world. I was returning to it in the only way I knew how. I'd spent my life taking lives to protect others. Now, maybe, I could protect something simpler, peace itself. The wind shifted, and for a brief second I thought I heard voices, distant, faint, like the mountains whispering names. Morrison, Hayes, the seals, even the old man from the village, his quiet peace. It wasn't ghosts, it was gratitude. And I let it stay. I picked up the carved wooden bird the child had given me months ago, still in my pocket, its edges worn smooth. I placed it on the rock outside the cave, facing the valley below. A small offering to the living. Then I turned back toward the fog and walked into it, not to vanish this time, but to belong. Because the truth is, I was never the legend. I was just the proof that legends are built from pain, not pride. And if my story ever finds its way back down these mountains, I hope it's told the way it truly was. A woman who carried too much, who aimed not to kill but to protect, who learned that silence can be the loudest form of courage. As I reached the ridge, the sky opened, streaks of light breaking through the fog, painting everything gold. For a moment the world is still, perfectly still. And I realize this is what I was always chasing. Not victory, not absolution, just stillness. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. The kind that doesn't demand forgiveness. The kind that simply is. I sit there until the sun burns through the mist, watching the light touch every corner of the valley I once fought in. No enemies, no orders, no noise, just life. And in that light, I whisper one last thought, not to the world, not to anyone listening, but to myself. Sometimes, the bravest thing a soldier can do is lay down her weapon before the war inside her ends. The fog moves on, the wind carries the words away. And somewhere miles below, another operator will steady her breathing, sight her target, and whisper the same three words that once guided me. For something greater. Because wars end. Stories fade. But the quiet strength behind them never does. And if the mountains remember anything at all, let them remember that once, in their endless silence, a woman stood in the fog and chose peace.